2, 1.
New York, NY. LaunchPod starts now.
Welcome to the New York LaunchPod, the New York Press Club award-winning podcast and the most interesting new startups, businesses, and openings in the New York City area. I'm your host and New York attorney, Hal Coopersmith, and in this episode, we are going to talk about manufacturing in New York City. Yes, it is happening, and there's a lot more than you think. In this episode, we speak to Stacey Weismiller of SecondMuse, an impact firm dedicated to designing, developing, and implementing entrepreneurial programs for manufacturing.
I mean, we have a really strong, innovative group of startups that are either making a software or a hardware product. We focus primarily in hardware. And from our end, it's saying, well, if people have ideas and they're thinking about making new products, why aren't we thinking about where they're being made physically? And so that's what we've been stepping into, is to say, let's keep that ecosystem strong here in New York.
But before we go to the interview, if you haven't already, remember to sign up for our monthly newsletter for unique content and insights at nylaunchpod.com and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite listening app. And we have a sponsor, ResQ, New York's premier residential rental compliance platform. Have you rented out residential property in New York State? If so, odds are that you are not complying with the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act enacted by New York State last year. And if you don't follow the law, your tenant may be able to legally stay in the property beyond the length of the lease. You won't be able to increase the rent by the amount you want to, or you may be forced to pay for damages to the property out of your own pocket instead of out of the security deposit. ResQ is designed to solve all of that and more. Go to ResQ.me and enter in some basic lease information, and ResQ takes care of the rest so you can relax and be more profitable. That's ResQme.com, RezQueme.com. And with that, let's go to the interview. So people don't necessarily think about manufacturing in New York City, but you want to change that.
That is very true.
How are you changing that?
So, I think that the most important thing is kind of a cultural change, right? So we forget that the things that we eat, that we touch, that we wear are made somewhere, right? A lot of things are still made in New York. And I think changing the kind of supply chain or the focus on how you get products is extremely important, but also going down the chain of command, right? Or chain of the supply chain to say, okay, who's actually thinking of these things, right? Who's the entrepreneur sitting at home saying, I want to change something and I want to make something? So to me, that's a really important way to change that.
So just to press you a little bit more on that, New York City used to be a manufacturing hub. We had all these factories, all these supply chain items, which you mentioned, but there were certain challenges. Labor is more expensive in the US. That's why clothing isn't manufactured. Real estate is certainly very expensive. So what is the type of manufacturing we should be thinking about in New York City?
Yeah, of course. Mainly, we should be looking at things that the end consumer is really here, right? Within the 5 boroughs or within kind of the tri-state. We should also be looking at things that have a very specific niche, right? So furniture, for instance. We still make a lot of furniture here in New York City. We're one of the largest consumers of office furniture. We have, again, a lot of real estate. So we do have a lot of commercial real estate that is using that work. We have a lot of architectural work that's happening here that does lend to us making, strangely, spiral staircases and wrought iron fences and things like that. So that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at. Also, there's a lot of questions about onshoring. Do we need to make everything here? Of course not. But there are certain aspects of products that certain parts of it should be touched here, whether it be adding value to it in New York, adding value to a certain product maybe in Connecticut or Pennsylvania, and kind of what I call the stone drop in the water. So there's certain ripples that go out, right? I think that you have to understand how far out you go in the ripple based on who your consumer is and what it is that they actually need, which is kind of that niche market.
So what do you see as the future of manufacturing in New York City as the stone kind of ripples through New York?
Yeah, a lot of it is kind of this final value add component to, again, things like furniture, We have a lot of work that we're doing in climate tech. So this is really what I work on specifically within manufacturing. I have a lot of teams building RF sensors, our smart city devices. Again, those products can be made fairly easily because they're pretty small. It's important that they're made in a place that they're also deployed. So I see that really as the future. There's a really strong connection between the end customer and who's actually making a product.
And what is SecondMuse?
We're basically an impact firm that is focused on designing, developing, and implementing programs across the world, specifically through entrepreneurs. So we focus on building economies that are kind of, equal for all. So we want economies that most people wouldn't step into, something like urban manufacturing, to really come to light and understand that it is something that we should be thinking of holistically and that it is not an endangered species. So we have over 70 employees across the world. We do have a hub here in New York City. We have a hub in San Francisco, Battle Creek, Michigan, Southwest Florida. And that's really what we do. We get into communities, we understand the needs of communities, and we try to understand the pockets of specific economic development lenses that need to change.
And what do you see that in New York City?
Yeah. So, the thing that we think about here a lot is really the hardware community, the hardware startup community, right? So they have an immense impact in the manufacturing community as well, right? We have a really strong, innovative group of startups that are either making a software or a hardware product. We focus primarily in hardware. And from our end, it's saying, well, if people have ideas and they're thinking about making new products, why aren't we thinking about where they're being made physically? And so that's what we've been stepping into, is to say, let's keep that ecosystem strong here in New York. Let's focus on entrepreneurs, whether they're first-time or second-time entrepreneurs, whether they're just out of college, they're moving here because maybe their partner got a job here and they have great ideas. Let's find ways to keep them here. And so that's kind of the ecosystem that we dive really deep into here in New York City.
And what are the common mistakes that a lot of these startups and new businesses are making in the manufacturing process?
I think it's kind of twofold, right? I think they assume that because there's some industrial pockets of the city, people are just willing to do work with them. And also that if they don't do work here, that they immediately have to go abroad, which is definitely not true. So we're trying to close that gap of not only talking to the entrepreneurs and the startups, but also the manufacturers, right? And trying to bridge that kind of cultural divide to say, hey, listen, here's an opportunity to think about some new business. So let's sit down together and let's actually talk about this product and if it can be made. And if it can't, then where else do we go? Because sometimes I think entrepreneurs actually, they fail because they don't have really strong mentors and really strong programs that are allowing them to think holistically when it comes to geography. That's really what we're trying to do. I am not really here to identify where you should be making your product. I'm trying to give you the best advice. If it makes sense for you to get in a car and drive 6 hours to a manufacturer and talk to them face to face, that's great. If it makes sense for you to get on an airplane to go talk to someone in China, also great. I'm here to support. I believe there's a lot of opportunity in our back door.
So in terms of manufacturing startups, I have to imagine, obviously, that they're a little bit different than your traditional software company, for example. And so what is the sales cycle like? What are the unique challenges to manufacturing startups?
Completely. Definitely a huge difference between the software world and the hardware world. The hardware world, they get into this place we call the valley of death, which is really where they've done their customer acquisition, they understand customer churn, they understand who in the market that's really focused on their product. They've maybe gotten some seed funding, and then they're going to start make the product. And they realize that their product is actually not really manufacturable, right? Or they go and they say, okay, I need 100 of these. And in that nice little waterfall model that they made, they didn't account for all of these additional pieces of cash flow that they are going to need, like tooling or setup or logistics. And this is where most hardware companies fail, honestly. And it's not because their idea is not amazing. It's not because they're not smart. It's not because what they have put together isn't going to change the world. It's that it can't be made. That's my job. So my job is to really get them through that valley of death and then get them to scale so that they can kind of wash their hands, be revenue positive, and then go create the next product.
And how does your fund work?
So I run an incubator called MCORE. It's funded by NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research Development Authority. We have a partner in our upstate in Rochester, New York, that does the same thing as us. We partner together. We really focus on the innovation component down here in New York City. We recognize we have a lot of startups here that have come out of universities, spun off of other tech companies. They have more of an old school industrial sector in Rochester with a lot of contract manufacturers that still exist. A lot of people with larger pieces of industrial real estate that our teams can take advantage of. And we run a community-based incubator. So we're doing mentorship. We're putting direct curriculum and education in their hands. We run really like a risk assessment tool called the MRL, the Manufacturing Readiness Level tool, that we take them through kind of step by step to understand where their risk is. We also put some funding in their hands through what we call MCORE bucks, so when they reach certain milestones on their roadmap. And then we also have handfuls of partners that are investors, other incubators, academic institutions that really come in and aid those teams along the way, that they're kind of quote unquote in the family at that point. And we've seen a ton of success. I've had 10 teams in my first cohort, 7 in the second, and we are launching our third. So very exciting.
And what's obviously through NYSERDA, there's a nexus to New York, but why have that connection to New York?
That connection to New York is super important because New York State itself is really focused on the zero carbon by 2050. So all of the products that we support are products that are going into the market to fight climate change. So that's really the lens we're taking. And that is why it's so important here in New York State, because we're really trying to get those products deployed in New York State. So, New York State having so many aggressive climate goals is really exciting. They know that to hit those goals, they have to be able to get entrepreneurs over that valley of death and get those products out into the market. And
how come you do not take any equity?
We're not really one of those companies. We want you to feel comfortable and vulnerable with us. That's a huge part of a community-run incubator. We want you to feel comfortable coming to me or any of my team members or your mentors and your accountability board and say, hey, listen, I'm struggling. I need help. And we don't want to be that team. We want to be a team to make sure that you are successful and your success is our success. So that is not the model we take. We'll probably never take that model. And so far, it's been successful.
So is it funded through just government dollars?
Right now, yes.
And how are you finding startups?
How am I finding startups? Through things like this, right? A lot of times it's just general outreach to people that are not in our network. However, we do have a very expansive network of startups. We've worked with over 200 startups in New York City alone over the course of the last 5 years that we've really been in this space. So we do have an expansive network of people. We do also have, as I mentioned, all of our partners that are either in the state or globally. We work with a lot of consulates as well. So our focus is to also do a lot of referrals. It's really important that we get partners who are looking at us and saying, hey, listen, this team doing great on the business end, really struggling on the manufacturing end.
And what is the downside if you don't take any equity?
The downside?
Yeah. Why would a startup not join?
Great question. Probably just time commitment, to be honest. I mean, we really do expect you to show up. We expect you to be a coachable founder. We expect you to work alongside us and our mentors. So a lot of times it's just strictly time commitment.
And what is the time commitment?
About 5 to 10 hours every 2 weeks. So it's significant. But we also, now that we're virtual, are kind of trying to limit that a little bit more because a lot of it was in person last year. And I'm excited for hopefully the next time it can be in person.
Well, that is a wonderful note to end things on. How do people find out more about you and your program?
Yeah, so our website is manufacturenewyork.com. Our application is live there. We also have a general email address that you can send a note to. You can also email me directly at stacey.weismiller@secondmuse.com. Feel free to ask me any questions, have a Zoom call with me. I'm open to discussing further.
And if you want to learn more about the New York Launch Pod, you can visit us at nylaunchpod.com for transcripts of every episode, including this one, or follow us on social media at nylaunchpod. And if you are a super fan, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated and does help people discover the show.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York Launch Pod. For more information, please visit nylaunchpod.com.